this edition of the Newsmakers. An end to the stalemate. After 2 years of deadlock, Lebanon finally has a new president. But can he mend the deep divisions in the country? Also on today's program, the issue of race in the race for the White House. We have a special report from the US on the Black Lives Matter movement and its position in the US election. And in Picture This, we have a treat for you, or a trick, with the best Halloween images from around the world. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. It's taken more than 2 years and 45 attempts, but Lebanon finally has a new president. Now, 81-year-old Michel Aoun must find a way to fix the country's problems. Since the last president's term ended in 2014, Lebanon has endured corruption scandals and a rubbish collection crisis that led to widespread protests. Michel Aoun has pledged to clean up all of that. But the war next door in Syria poses another threat. There are more than 1 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon, and the Shia movement Hezbollah has become increasingly involved in the conflict, widening sectarian divisions in the country. Today's newsmaker is Michel Aoun, as we ask if he can unite Lebanon.
Celebrations on the streets of Beirut as Lebanon's presidential vacuum has now been filled with the election of Michel Aoun. The former army chief secured 83 votes in the 128-seat chamber after 2 rounds of voting. The seat had been empty for more than 2 years as rival political factions could not agree on a candidate. But the deadlock was broken last month when former Prime Minister Saad Hariri decided to endorse Aoun. Hariri, who is heading the largest bloc in the parliament, is now expected to be appointed as the Prime Minister. Under a power-sharing agreement that put an end to the civil war in 1989, Lebanon's president needs to be a Maronite Christian, the Prime Minister a Sunni Muslim, and the Speaker of the House, Shia. The country's political factions are also allocated a certain number of parliamentary seats. But while this system has ensured peace in the country, it has also paralyzed the state. Until now, the parliament was divided between 2 main alliances supported by rival regional powers. Saad Hariri's March 14 movement is the largest bloc, supported by Saudi Arabia. And the Hezbollah-led March 8 coalition is backed by Iran, a strong supporter of Bashar al-Assad's regime in neighboring Syria. And while a deal has been struck on the country's next president, Lebanon's key political parties still disagree on almost everything else. The new president will have to tackle the country's $73 billion debt.
وشغلة ضرورية يعني شغلة ضرورية للبلد لحتى يضل واقف على جريه لانه البلد يعني صار تحت الصفر مؤسسات عم تسكر.
Aoun also needs to form a new cabinet. And allocating ministerial positions that maintain the sectarian balance could take months. It took the last prime minister under a national unity government the best part of a year before a cabinet was finally approved. The political crisis has crippled the government's ability to provide even basic services. The failure to deal with rubbish collection in Beirut has led to mass protests, and the issue still hasn't been resolved. Lebanon is also struggling to deal with the war next door. More than 1 million refugees fleeing the fighting in Syria have crossed the border. And Lebanon's resources are overwhelmed.
لا يمكن أن يقوم حل في سوريا لا يضمن ولا يبدأ بعودة النازحين.
But even if a government is formed, will the country's political parties put their differences aside long enough to tackle the major security and economic issues at hand? Christine Pirovolakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is Carl Sharro. He's a Lebanese blogger, satirist and political commentator. Carl, good to talk to you once again. So, after more than 2 years, you have a new president, or he's 81 years old. He's a new old president, I guess. Is there reason to celebrate?
Well, yes, I mean, on about his age, I sort of tweeted that his campaign started in 1988, and this is just to kind of put it in the context of how enduring those political struggles and careers are in Lebanon and the different paths that they take. Now, on the surface, you can say this is just old-fashioned horse trading behind the scene between the main Lebanese blocs, and there's no kind of reason to be optimistic. But I choose to look at it differently because I think, and much has been made of this fact that for the first time we're talking about a president that's made in Lebanon. And what we mean by that is he was brought into the presidency by the consensus of a lot of the major political blocs in Lebanon, as opposed to being dictated from the outside, as we used to see for the past few decades, with the involvement of regional and international superpowers. So there's optimism there. It's, if you like, it's a form of, this is kind of the best possible under Lebanese democracy at the current moment. The reasons to be optimistic is not just fulfilling what is, after all, increasingly a symbolic role in Lebanon, but that this appointment unlocks a key of changes that we can anticipate in the future, such as the formation of a new cabinet, but also a new election law and a new parliament, knowing that the current parliament is actually is unconstitutional, has extended its mandate. So what his election promises is unlocking some of kind of the obstacles to a return of a semblance of normalcy in Lebanese politics, which will bring with it democratic and political contestation, but we welcome that because we want those parties that at the moment are speaking from their sectarian and communitarian positions rather than any political programs. We would then hope that they would contest according to political programs, economic visions, development visions, and to kind of to try to move the country.
Now, you say that he's a president who's made in Lebanon, and you sound extraordinarily optimistic about him. In trying to get my head around this, yes, he is a Maronite Christian, and the president has to be a Maronite Christian, but there's an alliance with Hezbollah, and because of that, I've been reading multiple pieces from all over the place, not just sort of mainstream US media or UK media, but a lot of these pieces say Hezbollah and Iran have won with Aoun becoming president. Why do you think they've got it wrong?
I think the first thing we have to look at in this is kind of an old-fashioned Lebanese compromise. So we can't only look at the fact that someone who's allied to Hezbollah, I would say nominally at this stage, but we'll see how the circumstances develop from now on. We have to see it also as the return of Saad Hariri, who was a leading figure in March 14th, which was known by various cliches, pro-Western or pro-Gulf, or, you know, you have to look at the history of what happened in Lebanon since 2005 to understand the precise political positions of those actors. But you have a return of someone from that camp to the position of prime minister. So I would say there's compromise from both sides rather than an outright win for one side. And the proof of that is Michel Aoun didn't get elected president because Hezbollah nominated him. He only got elected president after Saad Hariri and his bloc nominated him and supported him through voting for him. And that kind of highlights the nature of the compromise. But let me just try to explain what I mean by my sense of optimism about this. It's not an optimism based on confidence in these political actors that I and many others in Lebanon feel that they don't represent us. But in our struggle towards more secular and democratic kind of politics, I think we have to kind of put them in a position where they're responsible for the government, they're responsible for the economy, rather than kind of the whole country paralyzed by a constitutional vacuum. And I think then if they don't perform, that's an opportunity for alternative voices, alternative political movements to emerge and start challenging them for real.
Let's talk priorities, finally. When we look at the war next door, Syria, it has unleashed havoc in Lebanon as well, more than 1 million refugees over in Lebanon. And you've got, for example, the one alliance, the one political alliance on one side of the Syrian war in terms of who they support and who they back, and Hariri's bloc supporting the Saudis and so on the other side. Is that the major priority, or are the priorities for the Lebanese more prosaic, like corruption and who gets to pick up the trash?
I think, to be quite clear about it, I think the Syrian conflict is not a priority, and I think what happened that led us to hear from both sides is a sort of undeclared consensus that they won't be able to resolve their disputes on that. So there's an undeclared acceptance by the March 14th and the Saad Hariri camp that they won't be able to do anything to stop Hezbollah from being involved in the conflict. And the flip side to that is Hezbollah and its allies won't also have any kind of ability to restrict the other camp from supporting the Syrian opposition and the Syrian rebels. So I think what's the agreement here is we won't be able to resolve these issues. Why won't we focus on the other the kind of problems facing Lebanon and how we kind of reorganize this political structure to suit our needs and prepare for the parliamentary elections. So I find those political sides have already kind of agreed on that, and they won't be able to resolve their differences over the Syrian conflict. What they're trying to do is to kind of not allow it anymore to paralyze the country. Now, if you look at what those issues are, aside from the refugees issues, there are economic problems, there are even basic things like we've heard a lot about it in international media, the inability to collect the waste and the rubbish in Beirut and other places. There's no electricity. So there are very real challenges facing the political class. And this in time will start chipping away at their power base. And let's not forget that Lebanon is quite distinctive in that side. All those kind of traditional leaderships and political parties, they do have to rely on people going out and voting for them. It's not, the perfect democracy, far from it, but they still have to win those votes, and there's always movements in terms of who wins, particularly in certain areas of Lebanon. So there is a space for political contestation that is largely dependent on political performance, and I feel Lebanese people's patience is running out with the current elite and their ability to solve the problems, and this will be an opportunity to actually challenge them and see if they are able to respond.
Carl, great to get your thoughts. Carl Sharo joining us there from London. Still to come on the Newsmakers, a special report on the racial divide in the US election. And in Picture This, the best images from the spookiest night of the year. It's the second day of our special coverage of the US election. Our correspondent, Randolph Nogle, has been to Ferguson, a city near St. Louis, for a closer look at one of America's newest and fastest growing social movements, Black Lives Matter. In 2014, Ferguson became the epicenter of anger over police violence against African Americans after a white police officer fatally shot an unarmed black teenager, Michael Brown. 2 years on, the protest movement continues to grow. So, with the election just over a week away, how will that anger manifest itself at the ballot box?
This country's greatest divide started 397 years ago when the first slave ships arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. And this country has been trying to bridge that divide ever since.
A new wave of racial tension in America has been ignited by a spate of police killings of African Americans. Many of them have been caught on camera. Ferguson is ground zero, where Michael Brown, a young unarmed black man, was shot dead by a white police officer 2 years ago. People in the area responded with anger and were confronted by a heavily armed police force.
You are violating the state-imposed curfew.
Which soon cracked down on what initially were peaceful protests.
It was horrifying. They over-escalated force and did a show of force that almost seems like they were trying to impress the Department of Defense for a military contract and not really trying to keep peace in the neighborhood.
But the police have a different view.
The defensive equipment allows cops to do their job, allows cops to make certain that people's right to protest and to exercise their freedom of speech and freedom of assembly is protected.
The Justice Department launched a civil rights investigation into Brown's killing and found that the problem goes far deeper into the conditions in poor black communities.
Amid a highly toxic environment, defined by mistrust and resentment, stoked by years of bad feelings, and spurred by illegal and misguided practices, it's not difficult to imagine how a single tragic incident set off the city of Ferguson like a powder keg.
And what they discovered in Ferguson, you can find in any community that has the same sort of racial dichotomy, both race and socioeconomic.
It's unclear how much has changed in the 2 years since, but Ferguson sparked a new national conversation and a new raw stripe of politician born out of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Y'all want me to pipe down? Well, try telling that to the parents of Oscar Grant, Eric Gardner, Sean Bell, and Mike Brown. See, they say this about race.
The thing that motivated me was the fact that nobody ever looked like me ever came to my neighborhood, my community, and taught me how important local politics were.
Bruce Franks is no stranger to battles. He entered the race for state representative of St. Louis's 78th district and beat the incumbent.
Bruce Franks, state rep 78th district. We sent Bruce Franks, we sent
Bruce Franks, we sent him.
What are they doing for police community?
He's now a shoo-in for the vote on November 8th.
I'm 32 now. I've been to 140 plus funerals. After Mike Brown and protesting for so long and being out in the streets, we can bring all the awareness in the world, you know, but at the end of the day, you know that the protesting is good, but it's just protest. Missouri was the last state to abolish slavery. It's just like a house. No matter how much you tidy up the house and fix the siding and fix the windows, it still has that foundation that's shaky.
The racial tension ignited by the Michael Brown shooting and other shootings of young unarmed black men is driven by a number of factors. One is segregation. Another is poverty. The economic and physical divide between what are two different worlds can be seen in urban areas across the country.
The backlash against police has not just taken the form of harsh criticism, but deadly violence. Attacks against police officers have spurred some in law enforcement to directly blame the Black Lives Matter movement and the administration of President Barack Obama.
I regret that tweet. I don't think that helped the situation that we found ourselves in. It was a very emotional time. I was watching police officers dying on TV in Dallas when I tweeted that.
To be fair and balanced, law enforcement is under attack in this country. I'm not saying it's not justified. The fact that law enforcement endorsed Donald Trump does not surprise me. And any group of people who are under attack will gravitate towards anybody who would side with them.
While Trump has been clear about supporting police and endorsing more aggressive measures, including hotspot policing and stop and frisk, the choice is less clear for many who support the Black Lives Matter movement.
Trump is terrible and Hillary's just a little bit better. It's the first time I know of where people are going to the ballots to not vote for somebody. We're gonna hire a candidate in the next 4 years, so we just gotta survive for 4 years.
Randolph Nogle, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Los Angeles is an organizer and activist of the Black Lives Matter movement, Moline Abdullah. She's also a professor and chair of Pan-African Studies at California State University. Thanks so much for joining us, Ms. Abdullah. Dr. Abdullah, do you have a candidate? With a week to go, do you have a candidate in this election?
No, we don't have a candidate in this election. Black Lives Matter is not endorsing any candidate. And I think it's very clear that when we look at the policies and proposals of both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, that we shouldn't choose either of those candidates. They're not representing our interests.
Who would you vote for? Now that it's just the choice of two, would you go for Hillary Clinton begrudgingly as a lesser of two evils, as so many other Black Lives Matter activists have said so?
Well, I think that it's important that we think about the structure of Black Lives Matter. So Black Lives Matter as a network. None of our organizers or leaders are endorsing any of the candidates. And it's also important that we begin to kind of think about whether or not the two-party system is the most beneficial system, especially for the most oppressed people of this country. So I think many of us are looking at third parties. We're looking at other items that are on the ballot. So here in California, there's some really important ballot measures that we'll be voting on. But in terms of choosing this lesser of two evils, this kind of framework, and accepting that framework, it's not something we're willing to accept. So of course there's freedom for individuals to vote for whoever they choose, but as a network, as an organization, we're not supporting either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. And we are beginning to think about how to engage in a way that disrupts this kind of corporate-owned two-party system.
In the summer, I had the opportunity to interview some KKK members. I asked them who they were voting for. They said Donald Trump. Is that any surprise to you?
No, not at all. And I think that that is actually the scarier piece of this. So absolutely, Donald Trump is a very, very scary figure. His positions on things, his willingness to kind of speak in a very radically right, oppressive manner is problematic, but more problematic than that are the people who are willing to follow him. His supporters are more problematic than that. So what we're seeing is kind of him spurring up this right-wing frenzy that has become violent in rhetoric, but also is becoming very violent in behavior towards those who are saying, you know, this is a new wave of anti-lynching. That's what Black Lives Matter is. We are the new anti-lynching movement. And for those on the right to say that we're getting out of line, that there's something wrong with saying that police shouldn't be killing our people, and then being willing to not only use their rhetoric, but use force and use violence to put down a movement that's essentially a peace movement is scarier than the candidate himself. And so the idea that the KKK is endorsing Donald Trump is not surprising, it is disturbing.
Very finally, let's try and take stock for a moment. We've had 8 years of a black president. Yet a lot of Black Lives Matter activists and protesters that I speak to tell me that race relations, the situation of police brutality and so on has never been worse in the United States. Is it in spite of having a black president, or is it because of a black president that somehow these things have sort of emerged and exploded?
Well, I think that's absolutely an overstatement that race relations have never been worse. I mean, we're a nation that's built on chattel slavery, so race relations were far worse, you know, under that system. I mean,
let's agree. Say in the modern era, since post-civil rights, people are saying it's really bad. But we've had 8 years of a black president. What is it? Is it in spite of having a black president, or because of a black president that somehow triggered all of these things?
Well, I think that it's a combination. I think that absolutely the presence of a black president and the notion of a black person occupying the highest office in the land has kind of awakened in the fears and the violence among those on the right. So it's not Barack Obama's policies, it's his very presence as a black man. Now, that was always beneath the surface anyway. So I don't think that he's to blame for it. I think that what's happening now is the kind of racism that was underlying what is the American political, economic, and social system is now revealing itself. So those of us who are black know that 8 years ago, we still had murders at the hands of the police. 8 years ago, our unemployment rate was still double that of everyone else. You know, so it's not that his presence has done it. It's not that his policies have done it. I think that the fears of the right, the fears of kind of white supremacist, white supremacy kind of in its truest sense have been awakened because of his presence in the presidency, his occupation of the presidency.
Dr. Moline Abdullah, thank you very much for joining us. In today's picture, this is Halloween. It's known now as the night of the year when little children dress up as monsters and travel door to door asking for sweets or a trick. But the festival has a much darker past. Let's take a look. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.